If we're talking about my first serious encounter with foreign language learning, it was when I moved to Israel, because what I learned there in 2 weeks was more than what I had to learn in my earlier lifespan. I was in a program called Ulpan, which is a very well-known immersion program. I was on a kibbutz farming actually, 24 hours a week, and 24 hours a week we were studying Hebrew without the use of English. I was with people from Russia, from Germany, from France, Spain, Argentina, Iran, Australia, and many other countries. So if we wanted to talk with each other without anyone being excluded, we always spoke in Hebrew inside the class and in that entire immersion environment that we were in. The experience that I had in Israel was so special. Learning a foreign language so intensely gave me an insight into people from all over the world. And when I came back to the United States, I decided that I wanted to learn more about Russian culture. And I ended up entering a three-year Russian major. Towards the end of that Russian major, I actually dropped out because the language program was not immersion. It was a lot of drills and a lot of memorization. And to this day, I can repeat back what I learned 35 years ago, but that didn't make me fluent. After that, I pretty much had no contact with foreign languages for 35 years. I would write letters in Hebrew occasionally to friends. I might find someone to speak to. But where I was living in New Jersey, St. Louis, and in San Diego, there weren't opportunities to speak foreign languages. But about 5 years ago, my younger son came home from Miami with a young lady from Brazil. And it was obvious that they were going to get married. And I thought to myself, I want to understand her in her native language. I want to be able to speak to her parents who don't speak English. And if I can show that I appreciate her culture that much, she'll be interested in learning my culture. And so that's when I decided to learn Portuguese. If I think about when I developed a passion for learning languages, it definitely goes back to the year that I spent in Israel. The teacher in this intensive immersion program, he was a refugee from Europe. His family was caught up in the Holocaust. He was Hungarian. Hungarian is a pretty strange language. And if you wanted to survive in Europe at that time, it would definitely be helpful to know some other languages, maybe German, maybe Russian, maybe French, depending on which army was there. If I think about the Russian language program I was in, it taught me perfect pronunciation, perfect grammar. But when it came to holding a conversation with a person that was outside the script of the language drills, it just didn't happen. So after 3 years, I was in a conversational Russian class, and the only other people left in the program were native Russian speakers. And I just could not keep up with them. And I felt like, not cheated, but I just felt inadequate. But I don't feel that way when I'm on italki. With italki, everything I do is conversation-based. Everything I do is very practical. Everything that I do on italki is very real. The people I'm talking to, I feel like I can touch them even though they might be thousands of miles away. So I'm sure people would want to know how I found italki. And I had, like I said, decided that I wanted to be able to speak with my in-laws in Portuguese. So I had been using a program called Duolingo, which is sort of a gamification online of language learning. But it's not something you do with someone else. So I was dying to start speaking to someone, and I found a video on YouTube, a woman named Julia who seemed fascinating, and she was an italki teacher. So I checked out italki, and she was no longer available, but I found that there were like thousands of profiles of like super fascinating people from all over the world. And so I had a selection of maybe 100 or more Portuguese teachers. And I was looking for someone who was articulate, that had a strong language background, but more so someone who was fascinating, someone that I could speak to about just anything. I couldn't imagine just being back in school and drilling. So I wanted to speak to someone who would speak to me, someone from whom I would learn a lot about Brazilian culture. So from the moment that I started using italki, I fell in love with it. I couldn't believe the kind of conversations I was having. And I was able to do it virtually without reference to English. My teacher and I would use hand gestures, pictures, emotional gestures, anything other than using English. And it actually came very naturally, like it did when I lived in Israel. The fact that they were on the other side of the world really didn't matter. We were able to conduct a deep, meaningful relationship from the get-go. And with each lesson and with the development of language skills, the conversations became deeper and more fascinating. And then definitely I was learning a lot about the individuals who were teaching me and the cultures, the places they lived, the struggles they had. And I shared mine, and we became very, very close friends. So people may find this kind of comical, but I've studied a lot of languages on italki. It started before my son Jonathan and Viviani got married. And my first goal was to be able to give a speech in Portuguese at the wedding. And let me tell you, it was such a great experience. When I was giving this speech, you wouldn't believe it, but there were a whole contingent of Brazilians there, and they were yelling, "Gerry's a Brazilian, Gerry's a Brazilian." It was like the most amazing feeling, you know? I felt like I accomplished what was my goal. I didn't want to stop the Portuguese, and I didn't. But then I decided, well, where do I go from here? I'm living in San Diego. There are a lot more Spanish speakers than Portuguese speakers. And so to learn Spanish, I thought, well, hell, if I could learn Portuguese, which is kind of like to the left of Spanish, and I know English, which is to the right of Spanish, then I could just, like, without even taking a lesson, if I had the right teacher, someone who knew both Spanish and Portuguese and English, then I could just figure out what comes in between. And that actually worked. And so I've never taken a book lesson, a formal lesson of Spanish, and yet I'm pretty darn fluent in it. So then I met this guy, Eliakim. This guy just blew me away. This Brazilian Portuguese speaker who had never left Brazil. He lived in a remote region of Brazil. And he was totally fluent in English and French, and he was a Mandarin Chinese teacher. And from the time I was young, I had Chinese neighbors. I always wanted to speak to them in Chinese, but the opportunity for various reasons didn't come about. And so I figured if this guy who's never left northeastern Brazil can learn fluent Mandarin, I can too, and he's the guy to do it. And so I got started on this Mandarin Chinese journey. And I've taken hundreds of hours of Mandarin Chinese with several teachers in China now. I had mentioned that in Israel I met many Russians and took university Russian classes. I still knew all that I had memorized. I just couldn't build conversations. And so then I found some Russian teachers, and I've had hundreds of hours of Russian classes with people from Leningrad, Moscow, and even Siberia. And then finally, I found the right Arabic teacher. And I thought, I know all this Hebrew. I've taken a little bit of, I know some Arabic from my time in Israel. And those languages are so similar that at this stage, it's a piece of cake. Kind of like the similarity between Spanish and Portuguese, the ease of learning Arabic after learning Hebrew was pretty accurate. And so I have a wonderful time with my Arabic teacher. And we find lots of similarities between the cultures as we're talking. So like the word for an Egyptian in English is Egyptian. But in Arabic, the word for the Egyptian dialect is Masri. And in Hebrew, the word for an Egyptian is Mitzri. So that's just one simple example of the similarities. And the more languages that I pick up, the easier it gets. And I've developed goals around being able to speak multiple languages in quick succession. I developed this crazy goal of learning multiple languages and to be able to speak them in quick succession. So sometimes I'll have 2 or 3 hours of Chinese in one day, starting at 5 a.m., 6 a.m., 7 a.m. Other days, most days, I'll have a Chinese lesson at 5, a Russian lesson at 6, a Portuguese lesson at 7. I'll take a break. I'll have an Arabic lesson midday, a Spanish lesson at 2 with someone with a Castilian accent from Spain. And at the end of the day, I always have my good friend in Colombia, so I get to speak Latin American Spanish every weekday. And that's a typical day for me when I'm not running my business and attending to my family. If I think about the early experiences in my life that eventually drove me to study so many languages, I can point to 2 things. One is that where I lived in New York, which is a multicultural city, most folks live in neighborhoods where they're just exposed to one ethnic group. You might live in an Italian neighborhood or a Jewish neighborhood, a Caribbean neighborhood. But in my neighborhood, there were maybe 20, 30 nationalities represented on my block. So I had an unusual multicultural experience when I was very young. And my dad was probably the most educated person in that neighborhood. And we found that with many of our neighbors, the kids really couldn't ask their parents questions. They came from traditional homes. Wherever they came from around the world, they shared one thing in common, and that was at the dinner table, they did what they were told. They could not ask questions. And, you know, the children had a certain place, and they couldn't break from it. Whereas in my house, it was common for us to ask open-ended questions of our parents. We could discuss things with them or even debate things with them. And so when we invited children to our houses, teenagers, they would always come away saying, I can't believe your family. You can really ask your parents anything? And so there were lots of questions about cultures and countries, war and peace. And I just love this ability to speak open and honestly across cultures. And I appreciated the fact that I had this kind of home. And it meant a lot for me to share this kind of open-ended, free, liberal culture with other people. You'd think that knowing so many languages now, to the extent I do, I'm far from perfect at any of them, including English. I actually had a very hard time reading. I had I would imagine a moderate case of dyslexia, but you combine that with a poor school system. And I was 2 years behind in reading. No matter how smart I might be, I still struggled with reading. Even in college, I was a slow reader. And so to be able to pick up these language skills after having suffered so much trying to learn English was like winning the presidency. Develop this determination. I figured if I could be so stubborn about not learning English, I could turn that stubbornness into motivation, determination, and I could do whatever I want. And I really wanted to show that I was an articulate thinking adult, despite the language learning problem that I had had as a child. I'd like people who are listening to this video to know that there is no one right teacher. I was looking for teachers, and I always look for teachers that want to have a conversational-based language study. Some may want to go by the book or a combination of the two. Occasionally I'll take grammar lessons, but you'll find the teacher you want among the thousands of teachers. Everyone's looking for something different, and there's no right way to learn a language. But italki is the platform where you're going to find the teacher you're looking for. And if one doesn't work, you can find another, because there are so many and the price is so reasonable. I'll tell you, I've had some very deep, profound discussions with teachers on italki, and that's what I'm looking for. I want that deep cultural, personal kind of experience that motivates me to go beyond 10 or 20 sessions. I want to be able to have 100 or 500 sessions with these teachers and not be bored with the person. Otherwise, it's difficult to go one-on-one for a half an hour, in my case, an hour every time. So I look for people that say they are happy to have open-ended conversations, that they'll share as much as they expect you to share. And that's worked well for me. And let me tell you, I've had some of the most difficult conversations was connected to an experience here in Poway. We had a shooting at a synagogue. I was trying to describe how I felt emotionally about being in a town where people were being shot because of their religion. Not only that, but we were having to do drills to know how to protect ourselves against active shooters. It felt very real to me. And here I am living in Southern California, a very beautiful community, and I have to worry about children being shot. But I'll tell you, the teachers that I speak to also have their life experiences, whether it has to do with problems with their parents or people who are very different in terms of their sexual choices or their life goals from their parents. I'm meeting a lot of people who are just brilliant and deep thinkers, and I want to say that the people I'm meeting on italki are people who have an ability to bridge cultures. It's so profound when you find people that live 5, 10,000, 15,000 miles away, and they feel the same way you do. And sometimes they don't. Sometimes they have very different opinions, but it's important for you to hear those opinions and ideas. There was this group of sessions that I was having with my first Brazilian Portuguese teacher. And I'm just trying to find words that we're going to have in common without using English. So we were talking about American culture and Brazilian culture. And then I thought, oh, What about if we created a new culture? And so I asked my teacher, what would you do if you lived on Europa? We weren't talking about Europe. I was asking her about what would we do if we were the first settlers on the moon of Jupiter that's known as Europa. What would this culture be like? And so this Brazilian teacher and I are just like planning, how would we organize society? And it was such a rage. And that conversation went on for hours. I'll give you another example. This past year, China's been in the news a lot, of course, with COVID-19 and the policies of our U.S. administration. So here on italki, I have 3 or 4 Chinese teachers, and sometimes we have political discussions. They're never arguments, but it's interesting to hear their perspective. They're hearing sometimes that Americans don't like the Chinese, and I always reassure them that we love Chinese people and that we're going through a struggle at this point in time. In terms of perspective and qualities, or the way we see ourselves in society, what I explain to them is that Americans hold a higher value, hold liberty as a higher value than responsibility. And it's clear from them that they hold responsibility as a higher value than liberty. And so right now, China has an economic freedom, but they don't have the political freedom we have. And they know it, but they're willing to sacrifice it for fellow members of their society. To that extent, I have to really admire them, because sometimes, in some ways, their society is more successful than ours. In other ways, our society is more successful. If I think about it now, I'd love a society that was a combination of Chinese and American society. But I would have never come to that conclusion if I wasn't speaking with these people in China going through the COVID epidemic with a different perspective than Americans. There's no doubt that learning a foreign language and doing it on a platform like italki, where you're face to face with a foreigner, could be scary and might make you a little bit nervous. But just take a deep breath and go with it. Go with the flow. And I'll tell you why. Because if you think about it, learning English was a habit that you formed. Your parents spoke to you in English day after day after day, and you learned it. And brain science tells you that people are great at forming habits. And the stronger the habit, the less you have to think about it. That's how we form words and sentences without really giving it much thought. All it is a matter of breaking the habit and forming a new one. Surely, if you ever went skiing, I'm sure you were scared when you went down the first slope. If you never drove a car, or if you drove a car but now you're trying to drive a motorcycle, it's a very different thing. I had some pretty scary experiences when I first started learning to drive a truck. It's a new habit. You don't drive a truck or a motorcycle the way you drive a car. It's just a habit. You form a habit and just have fun along the way. Relax, maybe think of it as like Pig Aladdin. It can be silly, it can be imperfect. You'll make errors every time. And I've had probably 2,000-3,000 hours of foreign language lessons, and I confess that in every lesson I was making mistakes. And sometimes it's like I can't stop laughing from the mistakes I make. And so just go with the flow, relax and have fun. You're going to meet great people, and you're going to laugh a lot, make great friends like never before. You might even find a new lover or a spouse. I'll be honest with you, I've never read a book of Shakespeare in my life. I've read Cliff Notes in school to get by, but I've never read Shakespeare. And so if you think about what fluency is, we're not talking about that standard. There are people who go on italki who are in the diplomatic corps, and certainly they need a high professional level of fluency. But there are lots of people that learn Brazilian Portuguese, for example, because they want to go to Carnival. And afterwards, some of them stick with it and some of them don't. You could just want enough of a foreign language so that, let's say you're in Germany, or I'll give you a great example, Catalonia. Catalonians and Spaniards are a little bit different. And if you said a few words in Catalonian when you were in Catalonia and didn't use Spanish, the natives will go wild. They just love you. So it may be a very simple goal. For me, the goal is to be able to have meaningful relationships with people. I don't need an advanced level for that. I could be an advanced intermediate in 5 or 10 languages, and it meets my goal. So everyone has their own goal, and don't worry so much about the goal as just enjoy the journey. Relax and have fun with it. I really don't think of it as study, although I study a lot. Mostly I'm just chatting, and I think of it more as a journey than a study. And that's the way a lot of people on italki speak about it. By the way, a lot of the teachers are also students on italki, so they have experience from both ends. And we're all just on this journey where we learn about other languages, peoples, cultures. And I definitely have plans to meet some of my teachers. I'm definitely going to go to China, and I have to visit some of the places they spoke about. And if I could do it with them, wow, that would be great. Recently, I was invited to a wedding in Bogota, Colombia. But I haven't been able to do any traveling because of COVID-19. We stay very close to home. And around the world, people are quarantined. But as I think about it now, even if I never left my country or my community or even my house again, I wouldn't regret all this foreign language study, because some of the very best friends I've had in my life are virtual friendships, but they're more real than ones that you have in person here in your town that you speak with face to face. When you're on the line with someone from the other side of the world, looking at each other, your hearts and mind connect, and those relationships are relationships of a lifetime. And I'll take the memory of these people that I'm learning on italki to my grave. They're just such special friendships. Don't be surprised as you're learning languages if people think it's strange, or they think the price is too high, or they think it's very sedentary. It's really none of those. So if you think about price, if you were to take martial arts, where you're just learning how to knock people up, you're going to spend thousands of dollars to do that. If you go skiing, you're going to spend $1,000 easily to get the equipment. By the time you finish your first weekend, you'll be $2,000–3,000 into it. If you're into music, you could spend $1,000 on your first instrument and before your first lesson. When you start doing language study, you could experience your first hour of a foreign language that you're just dying to learn for $5, maybe 10, maybe 15. You choose the price because each teacher has their own price. Another thing that you might find is that, in my case, my wife is concerned that I'm too sedentary, that I was at the computer sitting for too long. And so I just decided that I'd do the same thing that I did for the workers I have. And I bought um, a device that allows me to either sit or stand at the computer. And so I could do 2 hours sitting, 2 hours of standing, an hour sitting, an hour standing. And that works very well. Another recommendation I have is to get away from the office completely. I've had many, many lessons outside of my house. I've had lessons here in my garden where I'm showing this beautiful garden to my teachers, and they get to experience Southern California. A few times I've held lessons over by the La Jolla shore. We have this beautiful beach that's been occupied by seals, and thousands of seals. And it just blows my teachers away. You know, maybe one's in Moscow in the middle of the snow. You know, it's just a great experience. I've also had lessons at supermarkets. So I'll take them through the aisles. And of course, in many other countries, they don't have the food selection we do. So you could have weeks worth of language lessons in a local supermarket showing them the different kinds of foods that we eat here, the choices that we have. I remember when I was living in St. Louis, I actually had a job in a farm town about 60 miles out of the city. And there were people there who had never been to St. Louis. That's how isolated they were. So if you live in an environment that's unilingual, it can seem like a strange thing that you're doing, but it's a feather in your cap. And what better way to break your old habits, you know, to turn over a new leaf, to learn how to think out of the box than to learn a foreign language. So don't let any obstacles that are presented to you, physical, mental, familial, whatever the obstacles are, price, you can overcome all of it. And you can do it on italki. If you're considering studying languages offline, be my guest. It's a start, but it tends to be much more expensive with fewer results. Perhaps you're paying for university classes. You can make much more progress online. And there are, for example, language programs, immersion programs associated with universities where you could go to a summer camp and speak a foreign language or travel abroad. All those things involve thousands and thousands of dollars invested before you start. And so I think the price of entry for online learning and the return you get is so much better. If someone asks why I'm learning languages when I'm 65, you know, I like to tell them the story about how I had dyslexia and how hard it was for me to learn to read in English, and the pride I get from learning foreign languages. I'll also say that I was not studying foreign languages for 35 years. From the time I left university until I was about 60, until the day that my younger son came home with a Brazilian girlfriend, I had very little contact with foreign languages. But now, I'll tell you, the more and more that I'm speaking in foreign languages, the smarter I get. And I'm not joking. Many of my peers at age 65, they're getting slower. Maybe they're a little bit lazy. They're not at the energy level they used to be. And I feel like a kid again. I feel that my brain is actually functioning at a much higher level than it ever did. But as you get older, it's very important to use the skills you have and to keep learning. I'd also like to tell you a little story about that, because when I was in high school, the best book I ever read, and I've discussed this with many of my language instructors. I read a book called Future Shock. The idea of future shock, this is a book written by a futurist named Alvin Toffler. He said that with people living to be 100 years old, we're going to be changing our careers every few years. We might be changing our spouses. There'll certainly be ups and downs in the economy. And the best thing you can do is learn how to learn, and to learn to how to go with the flow, and to accept the fact that life is not going to be steady. You have to be able to adapt. So when you're learning foreign languages, you're constantly adapting. And this is great food for the brain. I have fears, but this is one fear I don't have. And, you know, I have new worlds open to me that I could never have imagined. You know, whether it's reading Portuguese poetry or talking about the political situation in China, or coming up with some crazy phrases in Spanish. When it comes to using these languages, they each serve a different purpose for me. As far as Portuguese goes, that's a language that I use with my new family in Brazil, my daughter-in-law here in San Diego, and my son, who also now speaks fluent Portuguese. And it makes our family closer. It gives us a connection that we could never have had otherwise. The Spanish is something that I can use every day. I don't, but I use it very frequently with my workers and with clients here in Southern California. I know when I hear a particular foreign accent instinctively, even over the phone. If I hear a Russian accent or a Hebrew accent, I'll often switch into that language, especially if I'm at their homes, because it gives us a cultural connection, and it gives me a heads up on my competition. My clients will feel like, wow, it feels like I'm at home when I'm with this businessman. And so it creates a really nice connection. I've always had a love for Chinese culture. I always wanted to be closer to it. And I've always loved Chinese philosophy. And there's something about the dedication of the Chinese people that I admire very much. And so I feel drawn there. As far as Hebrew, I've used since I was a child. I use it in prayer. I use it when I'm speaking with Israelis. I listen to news in Hebrew all the time. I understand that countries go through periods where they're at war and at peace. And countries don't have to stay at war. And being able to speak the other language is a part of developing understanding between peoples. And so for me, learning Arabic is very special. I like making connections throughout the Arabic world. And I should say that there are opportunities for partnerships that do not cost money on italki. There are thousands of people just looking for friends in other countries. I have an Arabic-speaking friend in Iraq and another one in Iran. And you can imagine those are very interesting relationships. And with them, I just offer free English because I'm interested in the cultural connection. So that's kind of it in a nutshell. So one thing about me is that I own a pest control company. I was a trained social worker. I was in computers for 20 years. And after the dot-com crash, I bought a pest control company. Many of my workers are Hispanic speakers. Some of them are native Mexican. It puts me more in their circle when I'm speaking to them in Spanish. And sometimes my Spanish is better than theirs at this point because Their Spanish is a mixture of English and Spanish, whereas mine is more Colombian and Castilian. So we learn from each other. And to go a little further, this person is not in my company now, but for a year or more, we had a worker who was Navajo. And I actually picked up quite a few Navajo phrases. And it was a very endearing thing to do. And like I said earlier on, it's not how much you know of a language. It's just about making a connection. I want to say something important about pricing. Don't judge your ability to pay for these language classes from the first profile you look at. It could be that you're looking at a teacher of English from Cambridge who's charging a high price. And for some people, that's perfect. They're at a high level of English fluency and they want to learn the King's English. But there are many people that are looking in other price ranges. You don't need to hire a teacher with that level of skill. You might actually find someone with an equal or better level of skill in English, for example, by working with a teacher from the Caribbean or from Nigeria. It's just as relevant, just as fascinating, just as great a connection. You can pick up a good ear for English, in this case, working with a Nigerian for $5, $10 a session. Much cheaper than a music lesson, a martial arts lesson. And the same thing can be said about any other language. Look around for the price that fits your need. Doesn't have to be a native speaker. Listen to the profile, listen to their videos, and see if you have a personal connection with the teacher. Find that and find the price range, and you're good to go. On italki, you're going to have an experience of a lifetime that you never imagined. You're going to go far beyond learning the language that you're interested in. You're going to learn about people and places at a profound level that you never imagined you would. And you'll have friendships forever.